Welcome to our 5:30 presentation of the Fox Group's Looking Back, Looking Forward with Sarah, Carissa, Johnny, Nanita, Alicia, and Bev.
We are going to be explaining how far we have come and where do we go from here.
At the beginning of our journey, we discovered that despite our life experience, including a recent critical social justice course, we truly did not know as much as we had first thought. The issues facing Indigenous students were deeper and more complex than we realized. The very fundamental nature of the profession we were entering was built opposite to Indigenous ways of knowing and learning. The curriculum we were being asked to teach was built on a foundation created by colonization and did not directly address ways to incorporate Indigenous education, yet we were being asked to incorporate it in our classrooms. An issue of concern for us was the government and school administration expect that significant changes are made by teachers within their classrooms so that Indigenous education is implemented, yet they do not outline how we are to do it. It was as if we were being asked to climb a mountain, but given no hiking poles or hiking boots. This was a difficult place to begin this journey for our group. But despite this difficult starting point, we shared a vision of hope, encouragement, purpose, and responsibility in our role as future teachers.
As we moved into week 3, the Fox Learning Circle continued its journey of discovery as we began to look at the residential schools and how ethnocentrism is still thriving in our Eurocentric culture. We also discovered as a group the lack of knowledge around residential schools, learning that there is so many people that have never even heard of these schools or of things like the 60s scoop. We also went on to discover what it meant to be Two-Spirit and how colonization essentially wiped this out. Our group looked at this and began to realize the importance of inclusion and what this would mean and look like within our classrooms. The discussion around Two-Spirit also brought forth the importance of the Indigenous' oral history and how important it was to their history. Their history becomes lost when it's not written down. And when we looked at how we are going to approach this in our teaching practice in a way that doesn't seek to classify and categorize individuals in the binary identity, the way of the colonizer, but look at a more fluid circular system.
We also talked about how little we had learned about residential schooling in our kindergarten to grade 12 education. Many of us did not learn of their existence until recently, and even then, our knowledge was very superficial and limited. As we delved through the materials this week, this knowledge deepened substantially, and a number of emotions were stirred up in us. Group members described this deepened knowledge as surreal and scary. We struggled to comprehend that these atrocities happened in our day and age. As we watched the films, we were drawn into thoughts about how these little people were feeling. These children didn't know what was being said to them as they were being forced to learn by osmosis or by punishment. As a learning circle, many of us did not learn until recently how the home language facilitates new learning, and so it really struck home that these children were being denied the opportunity to learn at the same time as they were being punished for it. The idea of this kind of trauma being done to little children day in and day out, and with their families taken away from them so they had nowhere to turn to for comfort or support, was heartbreaking. Going forward, we related this to how we can better support all learners today with compassion and encouraging use of home language in the classroom. We also realized that what is happening on the outside can come from trauma many years ago, and it reinforced for us the importance of stopping at assumptions of what somebody experienced and to take the time to remember that each person's history is different. In our teaching practice, we want to remember that every child's story is unique. Even if they come from similar places, we cannot make assumptions. This led us to the question of how do you as a teacher learn about someone's story and how best to support those students. We realized that we need the help of community members such as local elders. In our classrooms, we will strive to engage such support, as well as be careful in our resource selection, especially when it comes to triggers. We need to be careful to protect those in our care. We realized that to communities that experience the residential school system, how untrustworthy any Western education system would now be. Parents would have anxiety about entrusting to their children to the school system. As such, as teachers, we would need to put the time and work in to engage families in their children's education and welcome them into the classroom. From previous social justice learnings in this program, we have some good ideas on how to go about doing this, such as offering visits with parents before school even starts.
As our relationships developed, our conversations were becoming richer, more vulnerable and personal, and thus perhaps more meaningful. The course content and volume of content can be a bit overwhelming, and mutual support, shared learning, and shared humor are very helpful. Reflecting on D'Angelo and Sensoi's reading from the first week, it seems that we were at least striving to engage in many of the ways suggested. Further, as D'Angelo and Sensoi mentioned, that small group work can be extra tricky. Without making it formal, we often followed their lead. For example, we asked clarifying questions of each other, made connections to both other readings and classes, tried to find patterns and push questions further, discussed the implications of class content on our lives and work, and discussed challenging passages and other content. Following the previous week's focus on residential school, this week shifted our journey into one of finding a path forward. It quickly became apparent that relationship building and cooperation is paramount in Indigenous education, which directly conflicts with what residential schools brought. We really appreciate the many lessons about how to approach Aboriginal students, which also seem largely applicable to non-Aboriginal students as well. The idea of giving respect to get respect stands out, and we considered respect-based relationships versus when fear is interpreted as respect. Even in examples that we came up with where fear is respect got kids to be quiet, it really didn't seem they were learning anything. In this regard, mutual respect in relationships requires a sense of caring and includes meeting students where they're at. For example, sometimes true respect demands that teachers consider where students are at developmentally before defining behavior as disrespectful or whatever, because a kid really may just be where they ought to be and acting reasonably within that frame. As parents, it sometimes seems that our kids spend more time with their teachers than they do with us. Thus, as a parent, it seems only obvious that teachers ought to cultivate those caring relationships with students where they, as Goulet and Goulet from 2014 assert, actively participate in believing in the student, developing close personal bonds, valuing the individual and their culture, and building reciprocal respect and trust. When dealing with a classroom of students who all have individual stories that may include trauma and intergenerational trauma, we must make sure that, as Anoe asserts, students feel accepted, acknowledged, and respected in order to engage in school. As teachers, we also have to realize that the perceptions of students matter more than our intentions. Like Goulet and Goulet say, we need to go further than really authentically liking our students. We need to make sure that they see and believe we do. In this regard, we're reminded that Batiste suggests, unless we go deep and take more than a food and dance approach, it can actually be more shallow and thus harmful to bring Indigenous content into the classroom than if there hadn't been any implementation at all. In short, we have to go deep.
As we progressed from week to week, we felt as though we were peeling back the layers and uncovering a deeper problem that is inherently systemic. We would leave some of the weeks with ideas and optimism, and others with feelings of hopelessness and the inability to truly make a difference. We shifted our focus from thinking about the problem as a societal one to one that we could work on with the individual students within our own classrooms. We appreciated that we could share in our feelings and understandings in a safe place that would be the blueprint for our own classes. We felt that if we could provide our students with the same feelings of understanding, empathy, and support as those in the Anoe 2015 reading, then our students would be better able to deal with the complex problems that they would face in society as they made their way in the world.
The Fox group posed the question, how can we as educators infuse Indigenous education into a classroom full of non-Indigenous students? It was mentioned that there are some schools that are not implementing Indigenous education into the curriculum because there are no Indigenous students in the classrooms and is entirely ignored. It was also mentioned that teachers and leaders that do not have enough knowledge on Indigenous education often run into tokenism. Someone in the group used the example of making totem poles in a classroom and not providing deeper meaning and understanding behind totem poles is considered tokenism. It often feels as if education systems is categorizing and giving a title to Indigenous education. Instead, we should be infusing Indigenous education into the curriculum.
While creative realization is a process, here are several significant moments that many people are unaware of residential schools despite TRC and media coverage, that trauma is deep and carries through generations.
That consent-based education is imperative. Simpson in 2014 states that raising Indigenous children, or any children in a context where their consent, physically and intellectually, is not just required but valued, goes a long way to undoing the replication of colonial gender violence, and goes on to lay out that if children learn to normalize dominance and non consent within the context of education, then non consent becomes normalized. For Indigenous peoples, being colonized is having to engage in all kinds of processes on a daily basis that, given a choice, they likely wouldn't consent to. Also, that oral storytelling, both by teachers and students, is a precursor to reading and writing across cultures and a traditional Aboriginal teaching tool. Moreover, storytelling fits with Aboriginal epistemology, the nature of their knowledge, its foundations, scope, and validity, as in McCoe, 2008, page 148. Additionally, incorporating storytelling into teaching methods helps make classrooms feel more familiar and culturally relevant to Indigenous children, thus showing consideration and care while benefiting non-Indigenous students as well.
There is also stark contrast between Western and Indigenous epistemology. Indigenous epistemology aims to show children that they are sacred and have a place in this world. Toulouse, 2008, page 1. It's deeply jarring that colonists forcibly remove children from this nurturing belief system and expose them instead to the violence of residential schooling. And finally, there is hope looking forward, and we need to incorporate Indigenous epistemology into our schools. For starters, the Inuit principle of Tunganering, including warmth, hospitality, and kindness, exemplifies the importance of relationships and cooperation to education. Anhui, 2015.
In terms of classroom methods and techniques for Indigenous education, we have to remember to go beyond just plugging token elements of Indigenous education into lesson plans. Doing so can cause more harm than if nothing had been done to address Indigenous education at all. Goulet and Goulet said that in 2014. We need to integrate Indigenous perspectives and pedagogical approaches throughout our learning. We also need to focus on relationship building with students as well as families, caregivers, and communities.
Simpson went on to talk about consensual education, where we invite students to co-create their learning experiences and identify what they want to engage in. We need to remember we don't want to make assumptions. You need to take the time to remember that every child's story is unique when we are teaching. Even if they come from similar places, we cannot make assumptions about their experiences to date.
Toulouse, 2008, had multiple suggestions that we will embrace moving forward as well. That educators need to have high expectations and truly care for Indigenous students. That classroom environments that honor Indigenous students' culture, language, worldview, and knowledge. Teaching practices that reflect Indigenous learning styles, differentiated instruction and evaluation, and schools that have strong partnerships with the Indigenous community.
Thank you so much for joining us.